Hello and welcome back to the Solidity course. In the previous tutorial we have discussed the inheritance, and in this tutorial we will discuss the functions visibility. So we have 4 visibility options for functions in Solidity, that are public, private, internal and external. So let's try to understand the difference between these visibilities with the help of one table. The first parameter is, can we access the functions from outside the smart contract? So if the functions are declared as public or external, then they both can be accessed from outside the smart contract, whereas private and internal functions cannot be accessed. So what about within the smart contract? Can we call the functions inside the smart contract from the same smart contract? The answer is yes for public, private and internal, whereas externally declared functions cannot be called within the same contract. So just now in the last tutorial we have discussed inheritance, so which functions visibility can be accessed in the derived smart contract. If the functions are declared as public, internal, then they can be accessed in the derived smart contract. If the function is declared as private or external, then the function cannot be called or accessed in the extended or derived smart contract. And now what about the other smart contracts? If one smart contract is already declared, and now for our own custom smart contract, which is not the child contract of previously declared contract, we want to access some of the functions in that smart contract, then which functions are accessible? For this purpose, the functions that are declared as public and external can be accessed, whereas the internal and private cannot be. So now let's understand this with an example. Open remix and test.sol file. So here, let's declare the functions with 4 types of visibility, returning the various integers. So the first one is public function, which will be public, pure and return 1. We will discuss what's pure in later part of this course. Second one is private function, which will return 2. Third one is internal, which will return 3. And the fourth one is external, which will return 4. Now let's compile and deploy the smart contract. Since the remix environment is external to the smart contract, you can see we have only public and external functions accessible outside the smart contract. That means our first parameter in the table is over. Now let's check which functions are now accessible within the smart contract. Let's declare one more function, test function, which will be public, and one uint variable to save the return value from the functions. You can see I have set the compiler option to auto-compile to save the time. Now let's call the public function and see if compiler gives an error. It's compiled successfully. The warning shown here is just telling us that we have not used the local variable anywhere, that's it. Now for the private, it's also successfully compiled. Now let's call the internal function and no problem. And now let's try the external and it's showing us error, undeclared identifier. That means except from external, all other functions can be accessed within the smart contract. Now let's remove the test function and declare one more smart contract, contract B, and extend it to the contract A. Now in this contract, let's declare one unsigned integer x. We will test which functions are now available to access in this derived contract. If you remember the table, in the derived contract, except the private, all other functions visibilities are accessible. Let's check now. I have set the compiler to auto-compile. Now let's call the public function first and check if the compiler is giving any error. Public function is fine. There is no error from the compiler. Now let's check the private function. It shows us the error that undeclared identifier. That means private functions are only limited to the parent smart contracts and cannot be accessed even in the child contracts. Now let's try for internal, and it's fine. And for the external, it is also showing us error since the external function cannot be called within the smart contract. and we have derived the smart contract from the first one, it's same as calling the function within the contract. So the third point is also done. Now to check in the other contract, let's delete this contract B and create a new contract. In this contract, let's create an instance of the contract A. We will store the contract instance in the variable X. The contract instance can be created with new followed by the contract name. Now we have an instance of the contract stored in the variable X. Now let's create a new unsigned integer public variable Y and try to call the functions from contract A. Now for the public function, we call the function as x dot the function name. It's compiled successfully. Now let's deploy the contract and see if we got the value in the Y variable. As you can see, everything is fine and we have got the value. Now let's try for the private function. As you can see, we have a compilation failure. Now let's try for the internal function. This also failed. That means we cannot access the private or internal functions in other smart contracts. Now let's check for the external one, and it's compiled successfully. Let's deploy and check if we have got the value in the variable or not, and it's completely working. So this was all about the function's visibility and its scope in the Solidity. See you in the next tutorial.